that you all found your way here for this later lecture today. It's a real treat to have our guest with us today. Before we begin, I do want to remind you please to turn off all electronics. Take a moment to do that. Thank you. Did anybody vote today? Oh, excellent. That's what we want to see. Great job. Anybody vote for the first time today? Nice. Congratulations. Welcome to democracy. Good for you. All right. I'd like to go ahead and get started, please. It's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. John Turner. Dr. Turner is an award-winning associate professor of history at Colby College. He holds a PhD from the University of Michigan in Near Eastern Studies. Dr. Turner has particular scholarly interests in Islam, pre-modern Islamic history, modern Middle Eastern history, Islamic law, particularly the development of the Hanbali school. He's also very interested in Iran. Please welcome Dr. Turner.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. Mic check. Okay, great. What I want to do tonight is I'm going to sketch out a historical context for the Quran, because in order to understand any religious text or practice, you have to understand the context in which it begins, and then also how it evolves. And I'm going to hope I don't trip on this thing, because I'm a pacer and I like to walk back and forth. But in order to really get started, I want to begin with some basics about Islam. You've probably all heard of the 5 pillars of Islam. So let's go through them really quickly. So what are the 5 pillars of Islam? Just shout out one. Don't be shy. Which one? Fasting. Fasting during the month of Ramadan is a practice that you're supposed to do from sun up to sundown. You're not supposed to ingest any water or food or anything like that. But of course, the practice of when you start both the month and when you end the month is based on sighting the new moon. And when you start in the morning and when you end in the evening is also based on when you can no longer see the sun or when you can see the sun. And so it varies based on where you are as to when you do the fast and how long it actually lasts. If you're in, say, Sweden in June, you're going to starve. If you're in Sweden in December, then, well, Ramadan is really easy. Actually, what you do is you set your clock to Mecca time in terms of you have as many hours a day as Mecca has during that month. What's the second one? What's another one? The Hajj, the pilgrimage. Once in a year, once in your lifetime, you are required, but not really, to go to Mecca to perform the pilgrimage rites around the Kaaba in the center of Mecca. And I usually describe this as obligatorily optional. If you can't do it for financial reasons or for health reasons or whatever, God doesn't hold it against you. But you should do it. And how one does the pilgrimage varies greatly by your interpretation of what the texts tell you need to do. What's a third? Prayer. 5 times a day you're supposed to pray. How you pray varies based on who you are and your interpretation of the text. The Quran tells you you have to pray. It doesn't tell you how to pray. How you pray, you learn from reading the Sunnah. I'll talk about that later on. Finding through the text of the life of Muhammad, what he did and said, that gives you guidance. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But how one prays varies based on if you're Shia, or what kind of Shia you are, if you're Sunni, if you're Sufi, if you live in Indonesia, or if you live in Egypt, or if you live in Detroit. It varies based on your interpretation. So what's another one? Charity. It's zakat. It's usually translated as almsgiving or charity, but it's not exactly that. It's actually a tax that one pays on one's wealth that one owes to the poor. So it's not charity because it's actually an obligation that you have to pay it. Now the question is, how much does one pay? To whom does one pay it? And that is subject and open to interpretation. And what's the last of the 5 pillars? That is 4, right? That is the profession of faith. It's called the shahada, the witnessing. It is the profession of belief that there's only one God. It's absolute monotheism, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God, and that is an affirmation of belief that the the Shahada is two things. It does two things. One, it asserts absolute monotheism. Two, it asserts that the Quran is truth and it is the literal word of God. We'll talk more about that in a second. The Shia, actually, not all Shia, but many Shia actually add a third part to it, that Ali is the agent slash helper slash friend of God. Depends on how one translates the word Wali. Ali Wali Allah. And I mention that because in each of the descriptions of the five pillars that we just went through, diversity is a key interpretive principle. How one does Islam varies. And I use that phrasing quite intentionally because the word Islam means submission. And a Muslim is the one who submits. Islam is submission to the will of God, and a Muslim is the person who does that thing. And how one does that varies in time and place and way of thinking. So it matters where you are, when you are, and who you are as to how Islam functions and how one does this thing. And I also want to highlight that because people tend to think of Islam as it's a thing. Islam, it is. Islam says. Islam does. Now, Islam doesn't say or do anything. Islam is a faith practice. It's a religion. Muslims are the ones who believe in it, and they say it, they do. And they'll make claims about parts of their faith and assert that it is truth, and their interpretation is truth. But reality is, there's lots of space for disagreement. And there's lots of room for interpretation and finding different meanings, and where one is and who one is makes a difference in how one reads. And that's important for how the Quran is processed and how one uses it. Now, let's talk about the life of Muhammad, because it's very important for how one understands the early days of Islam, but also the Quran as a text, because the Quran comes into a context and it is received by human beings in time. Now, Muhammad is born, supposedly, allegedly, maybe, we don't know, in 570. The 570 date, the calendar that they used wasn't the calendar that we have now or the one that they use, Muslims use now. So calculating dates is kind of hard, but also, it wasn't like he was born and everybody said, oh, this is going to be prophet, let's write down his date. Let's make sure we know when his birthday is. They didn't do that. Most of humanity didn't mark those things in that way at that time. The projection of 570 is important for later on. Now, Muhammad is orphaned quite young. His father dies, then his mother dies, and he's raised by his uncle, a guy named Abu Talib. And he's up, if you look at the 619, that first name, Abu Talib, that's his uncle. That's the person who raises him. And Abu Talib is engaged in the family business. Well, actually, it's the everybody business. Catch this before it falls asleep. There. Now, the family business, the everybody business at this point, where he's growing up in Mecca, is trade. Mecca is an interesting place in that it is not an oasis town. An oasis is an area in an arid climate where water comes up naturally from an aquifer underground and pools on the surface, and you can have plant life and trees and things like that. Mecca is not one of those places. Mecca exists, and no, I don't need to remind me later. Thank you, that's okay. Yeah, we're good. And I'm going to zoom in, look away from the screen, it'll make you nauseous because it'll give you motion sickness. And apparently when I say that, everybody looks at the screen. This is the Kaaba in Mecca. I'll zoom out just a little bit so you can see it more clearly. It's a cube-like structure. Anyone has that? Thank you, Google. There, okay, now you can see it. It's a cube-like structure. It's not actually a cube, it's sort of taller than it is the other sides. This pre-exists Islam, and according to tradition, it's built by Abraham, which highlights something about Islam that is worth noting, that it is an Abrahamic religion. Intentionally, avowedly, the Quran talks about Abraham as the patriarch, and that this is part of that same tradition as Judaism and Christianity, and we'll get to that more in a second. But the Kaaba is the reason why anybody would go to Mecca before Islam, and actually now after the rest of Islam. That the Kaaba is a place of worship where they would house the idols. This is before Islam. There are no idols in there. There's nothing inside of it now. Well, there's actually some lamps and stuff. But the Kaaba forms a focal point, and people will travel to Mecca to engage in trade because they're going to go and they're going to pray, they wheel their God out of the... Technology is your friend until it's not. You would come to Mecca, you would wheel your God out of the Kaaba, you would take it into the courtyard, and you would do your praying stuff, and then you put it back in, and then walk away and be done. And while you're there, because it's a place of no violence, you're not supposed to be fighting or cheating or doing any sort of bad things there, because you're worshiping your gods, you would engage in trade. And so it becomes a marketplace as people are making their way up and down the Red Sea coast. They would divert inland to go to Mecca, and Muhammad will grow up learning how to be a merchant. That's important because a lot of the later content, when we talk about what's in the Quran, would work really quite well for someone engaged in that environment. Now, Muhammad grows up to be a merchant. He ends up working for a woman named Khadija. That's the name 619. That's the other name up there. 619 is when those two people die. We'll get to that in a second. Khadija is a wealthy woman who is a business person, who's successful. She is engaged in long-distance trade. She has people working for her, lots of people actually. And Muhammad will be one of those. They'll fall in love, they'll get married, they'll ultimately have 6 kids. Only one of them will actually survive, and she'll have children, but she'll be the only one. But Muhammad and Khadija establish a life together that allows him to relax a little, to take a step back from the hectic pace of his life, and he starts to contemplate the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. And of course, that's 42, but that's the answer to this question. Muhammad is meditating on why we are here. What is the point? What is the purpose? And in 610, he has a revelatory moment. In 610, he's meditating in a cave right outside of Mecca, overlooking it, and all of a sudden there's a flash, and an angel, the angel Jibril in Arabic, thumps him on the chest and says, Ikra. What? Ikra. I don't know what I'm supposed to Ikra. Explain that in a second. And then a third time, snaps him in the chest, says Ikra. And all of a sudden, boom, in his head, in his brain, is the first 5 verses to be revealed from the Quran. Or this is how the tradition goes. Traditionally, it's Surah 96, verses 1 through 5, but no one actually really knows, but that's the best guess. The word Ikra means you recite. It's an imperative. Quran, as a word, is the noun form of that verb. It means recitation. So Ikra, you recite. Quran, recitation. And that highlights a really important thing about the Quran. I'm going to do a tangent, an extended tangent right now from the narrative, to talk about the Quran as a text. Recitation. The Quran is meant to be heard. You're supposed to listen to it. You're supposed to recite it. You're not supposed to sit and read it. Well, you can do that. But it is meant to be listened to. And so I'm going to play the first surah for you. And surah, by the way, means chapter. The first surah is called the Fatiha. And this is part of every single prayer. So 5 times a day, this would be part of the prayer. That's not part of the verse. That's an invocation that one begins with. It's revealed in bits and pieces throughout the rest of Muhammad's life. So between 610 and 632, he'll receive bits and pieces as he goes. And the Quran will be arranged by length. There are 114 surahs, so 114 chapters, and they're arranged by how long or how short they are, going from longest to the shortest, with the exception of the Fatiha. The Fatiha is one of the really short ones, and it's the first one, but then the second one and the third one, they go in decreasing order of length. The Quran is, according to Muslims, the Word of God. Not in a metaphorical sense, but in a literal sense, that God speaks Arabic to Gabriel, gives Gabriel the transcript of this, which is the Quran, and then Gabriel gives it to Muhammad. And when Muhammad recites the verses, he is not speaking as Muhammad. It is the Word of God in a literal sense that God is speaking Arabic. And so the Quran as a text is in and of itself not the inspiration of God, but the actual text of God. God has given you a transcript. I'll come back to why that's important. Well, there are a variety of reasons why it's important, but I'll come back to that importance in just a little bit. Are you with me? You okay? Yeah? Okay. If you have questions, like raise your hand and shout at me, because it actually makes me nervous when people are really quiet and staring at me. So just like, hey, wait. And chances are good if you have a question, somebody else is thinking exactly the same thing, so you might as well be the one who gets credit from them for asking it. Now, the Quran, we know, is a very early text. The Quran that we have, we know is early. And whatever one thinks about whether Muhammad or whatever about that, it is assuredly a text that is complete by the end of Muhammad's life, and it is arranged and collated within 20 years of his death. We have Codex, a book between two covers that is clearly essentially the same Quran as what it was at the point when Muhammad was alive. And one of the cues for knowing that is that there is not a Shia or a Sunni Quran, there's just the one. And that indicates that this is actually really predates that, which is important to note. Another thing about the Quran, and this is often really quite confusing for people who are not believers, they will sit down and they will say, I'm going to read the Quran because I want to understand, and you sit down with the book and you start reading and it doesn't tell you a story at all. The thing about the Quran is it is not a narrative text. It is not arranged or designed to tell you a story. It alludes to stories in the Hebrew Bible and in the Gospels. It alludes to those things, but it is not actually going to tell you the full story because it assumes that you know those already. Which means that if you try to pick it up and just read it, it's going to be confusing. People need guidance when they first encounter the Quran and help sort of parsing what it means. Another feature of the Quran that often makes people a little bit, they don't find it a compelling text is they sit down and they read it, and it repeats itself a lot. It'll say the same phrases again and again and over, and it'll repeat, and it'll come back to the same idea. And this is actually a feature. If you're thinking in terms of computer coding, this is a feature, not a bug. This is part of when I said it was a text that's meant to be heard, that's not something that you just really sit down and read. It is designed for those repetitions to resonate, that you hear the sounds of it and it doubles and magnifies the impact. So that when you're listening to one verse, you're hearing a recitation like you just heard, and you'll hear that sound, you'll hear sounds very much like other sounds in other parts of the text. The text is very tightly integrated, so that you're listening to one set of verses, you're also at the same moment going to hear echoes of other verses, and if you know the Quran really well, this actually magnifies the intensity of the effect of listening to it, is that you are listening to one verse, but you're also getting the meaning of multiple other verses cascading on top of you at one time. A really banal example, a way of explaining this that is a little less sort of abstract, is that when a musician takes an old song and samples it, so they're writing their song, they're going to play their song for you, and they sample someone else's song and they include it in theirs. The reason they do that, it's not just because, oh, hey, that's a cool sound. It is that. The intent is to trigger in you a response that you had to that other song, either as a contrast or as a magnifier, so that the sounds from that other song build on what the artist is doing in their song and make it actually deeper and more meaningful and more powerful. The samples aren't just random. There's actually an intent behind that. And the Quran functions in much the same way. That when you are listening to one thing, you're also hearing, if you know the text well, you're hearing probably 2 or 3 other verses at the same time. which means that for people who know the Quran well, it can be an overwhelming experience to listen to. That's why it really is a book that's meant to be recited. It's a book that's meant to be heard. You can read it, but be warned that if you sit down and read it, it's not actually going to make a whole lot of sense to you unless you have some guidance, unless you have some help. Now, you with me? You okay? Okay. I see a couple thumbs up. All right. They're still alive. All right. The Quran as a text is going to be revealed through the rest of Muhammad's life. I mentioned that. And that's going to be an important thing for understanding the context of what comes. Now, back into the narrative. So our extended tangent we put aside, now we're back into the narrative, and I'm going to click on this before it goes dead on me. Muhammad begins to have the revelation. He's freaked out, as one would expect, right? You're hearing voices, you think, oh, what is this? I don't understand. He comes down out of the mountain, goes to the first person, of course, his wife, and says, I've had this experience. What does this mean? What happened? And she says, you're not crazy. This is actually this thing, prophecy. That the idea of prophecy in the Arabian Peninsula at that time was a known quantity. That the Hebrew Bible and the Gospels were known. And the concept of biblical prophecy was a known quantity. And she explains to them that, hey, actually, this is what's happening. 610 makes Muhammad how old? He's 40. That's why the 570 date is usually pointed to, is because that's the age at which you're qualified to be a prophet. Sorry. According to biblical tradition, you have to be 40. That's the point at which your brain is cooked enough that you can become a prophet, and therefore you can receive the revelation from God. In 610, Muhammad has this experience, and immediately he tells his family. Nobody doesn't tell anybody else, because, people look at you really strange if you go out and say, hey, God is talking to me, and he says that this, and this, and this, and oh, by the way, those gods in the Kaaba that you come and worship with, they're false and they need to be smashed. You might worry that would be badly received, right? Yeah? You'd be right. That would be an accurate assessment. When Muhammad starts to tell his family members, they're like, dude, okay, I believe you, but stay on that, because, people... Revelation comes in 6:13 and says, no, this is not for your family and friends. This is for everybody. You have to go out and you have to tell everybody this message, and you have to start publicly preaching, which you will do, and cue persecution. You know how this goes. If you're a prophet and you say, all of those gods are false gods, you must smash them, and the economy is going to tank as a result, that's not going to be well received, and so people start to persecute him and his followers. But as long as Abu Talib, his uncle, who's a pretty powerful guy, and his wife Khadija, who is powerful in her own right, as long as they're still around, he himself is okay. However, humans are human when they die. We are mortal beings, unless you're Thor or something. Sorry. Couldn't resist. When they die, all of a sudden, Muhammad is exposed. He is now in danger. Now, here's another quick tangential aside, that at this point, after his protection has died, he will take a miraculous night journey. Okay, it's going to zoom in again and do the swirly thing, and Muhammad takes a miraculous night journey at some point in this window to, it's going to take a while. Yeah, it's the Dome of the Rock. Jerusalem is where Judgment Day is going to happen. Jerusalem is where you will find the second coming of Jesus, and the prophets will all gather, and there'll be the final battle, and at Judgment Day, and everybody will be gathered there, and you're going to heaven, you're going to hell, and all of that sort of stuff. And Muhammad takes a miraculous night journey, according to tradition, to this place, and what's under the Dome of the Rock? He will ascend to heaven and have a conversation mediated, of course, with God about prayers and those sorts of things. The reason I bring this up is that Jerusalem is the third holiest site for Muslims for some very specific reasons. One, that it is where Judgment Day is going to happen. Two, it is where God physically touches earth to pick Muhammad up and put it back down again. That's what the Dome of the Rock is. It's built in 692, and it marks the spot where Muhammad made this trip to heaven. And then miraculously, he goes back to Mecca. And it's gonna do that. We'll zoom back out. Hopefully it'll work. Now, in this context in which Muhammad is having experiences of persecution and he is starting to feel the pressure of being a prophet unwanted in his land, of course that's true of all prophets, that are always going to be persecuted according to, that's how it goes. In the town of Yathrib, north of Mecca, there are a group of people who start to hear Muhammad's message and say, hey, you know what? He's a pretty cool guy, and we actually are starting to hear his message, and we start to think, actually, he's onto something. He's not on something, he's onto something. I believe him. I can't resist. One day I'm going to get struck by lightning. There'll be a spot of scorched earth behind me. The followers in Medina, well, it's actually Yathrib, but Medina is the city. It's actually Medina to Nabi, the city of the prophet, is the full name for Medina. And they will invite Muhammad to come and join them and become the leader in Medina. And he will do so in 622 in an event called the Hijrah. And the Hijrah is a really important thing to note. 622 is one of those red letter dates in the calendar because this is the point at which the Islamic calendar begins. Year one is when the Hijrah happens. And that's an important point to consider because they don't choose the date when Muhammad was born. They don't choose the date the prophecy begins. They don't choose the date he starts his public preaching. They choose the date at which the Ummah, the community of believers, are allowed to practice as a community of believers, mostly free of persecution. That they're able to govern themselves as a community of believers under their interpretation of what the law is. And we'll talk about the law in a minute. That's a major point. Just for context, our system of AD, CE, whatever one wants to call it, that's actually an invention in the 6th century. And it isn't in any appreciable use until the 8th century, when a guy named the Venerable Bede in Northumbria in England writes his ecclesiastical history of the English peoples and starts to use it, and then people say, oh, hey, that's a cool way of dating things, let's use that. Within 22 years, we actually have a document that has the date 22 Hijri on it. Within 20 years, they're using this dating system, which tells us a lot about the importance of it. Now, when Muhammad moves to Medina, he becomes the head of the city, in essence, the ruler. The text of the Quran shifts. You can roughly divide the Quran into two chunks. You can't really know exactly what the chunks are. There's a lot of dispute over when verses are revealed versus other verses. But you can generally say the period from 610 to 622, those are the Meccan surahs, and they tend to be really apocalyptic. God is coming now, you are going to get judged, you're going to hell, or you're going to heaven. And if you're not behaving, it's definitely hell. It's apocalyptic and warning. And these are typically the shorter surahs in the back of the book. When you go through Surah 113 or 114, as you get towards it's really about fire and brimstone. Once he transitions to Medina, you start to see longer surahs that talk about practical realities. My favorite is Surah 2 verses 282, which tells you that you really should use written contracts, not oral contracts, because they're more easily to verify, and oh, by the way, you should have two witnesses, just to make sure that both parties who signed it are the ones who signed it, and we're all in agreement that the basics of the text. That's the kind of thing you do when you're running a city or running a government. That is not the heaven is here and hell is coming and you better get ready. It's more practical. Another thing that happens when Muhammad is in Medina is war. Warfare starts with the people in Mecca, because Muhammad is still saying the Kaaba in Mecca is that central focal point, is the house of God built by Abraham that should be where you are facing when you pray. When Muslims pray 5 times a day, that's what they're facing. They're not just facing Mecca, they're facing the Kaaba as a focal point for the Ummah, as a focal point for the energy that they exert in praying. It is the holiest spot on earth. And for Muhammad and his followers, it's intolerable that Mecca won't let them come and pray there. And for Mecca, it's intolerable that Muhammad says, those idols that you keep in there are false, and we're going to smash them the first chance we get. And so fighting breaks out. The Quran talks about fighting. And I want to address that really quickly because it's an important point. That often Islam is accused of being a violent religion. The truth is that how one reads a text largely based on what one brings to the reading of the text. And that you can read the Bible in a really violent way. You can use it to justify all kinds of acts. The Crusaders certainly did. You can do that with the Quran as well. You can take any religious text and you can read it in a way that allows for violence. The Quran is overt in that it gives rules for fighting. But you have to recognize that it's in a context in which Muhammad is actually fighting. What people who are from mostly Christian environments find really jarring about that is they're used to prophet Jesus and pacifism and peaceful. And you shouldn't think of an analogy between Muhammad and Jesus. That's actually not the right analogy. The analogy is Muhammad and Moses. You have a warrior prophet who's building a community, who's building a legal system, a way of governing a society. And yes, there's fighting involved, and that's part of how one lives in this environment. It's contextually bounded, it's temporally bounded. And so when you're reading those verses about fighting the Quran, you have to recognize that there's a specific space for that. There's a specific reason why that's there. That, unfortunately, fighting is part of how humans have done business for a very long time. Now, you with me? That usually prompts 1 or 2 questions. Are we okay? Okay. Now, Muhammad will eventually win the fight. There are a number of battles, there's some setbacks, there's some wins, but ultimately in 630, he will take Mecca, mostly by a surrender. So the Meccans will say, okay, we give up, we're going to sign on to your new religion, you got us, we believe. And they will join up, and Mecca will become part of Muhammad's realm. Kingdom's not the right word, because he's not a king, he's a prophet. That Mecca now is part of Muhammad's domain. He does not move there. He stays in Medina. And 2 years later, he'll die. Now, what happens after he dies that's an entire course worth of stuff. And I would love to tell you about it, but I'm not going to, except to say that caliphs are part of it. Ultimately, Harun al-Rashid, Aladdin is not part of it. Or at least not the Disney version of it. But the community is left without its conduit to God, and is left to figure out how it's going to live in the right way on the path as established by God that gives them guidance for how to get to heaven. And this is where I'm going to talk about Islamic law now. This is typically a point of confusion for people, it's a point of question, it's a point of curiosity. I'm going to delve in a little bit and talk about how Islamic law works in sort of a basic sketch, because it'll help you understand and see how the Quran might be used for governing one's everyday life. And I got to first start with 2 terms that I have to distinguish. Sharia, and that is usually translated as Islamic law. So when someone says Islamic law and they say Sharia, well, they usually say those 2 things are equivalent. They're not exactly equivalent. Fiqh is what they are probably talking about when they say Sharia. Fiqh is the F-I-Q-H up there. That means understanding. Sharia is the law as God knows it. The law as it resides in God's brain, for lack of a better term. It is the law as God understands it. Fiqh is the human attempt to approximate Sharia. The human attempt to understand what it is that God wants you to do in this life so that you can live the right way and ultimately go to heaven. Be the best person that you can be. Be the best person you can be so that you can go to heaven. Fiqh is the human attempt to approximate Sharia. Sharia is a certainty. Fiqh has embedded in it an uncertainty principle that legal theorists will tell you, I don't know law long, I have to admit that I don't know law long. I enjoy reading constitutions for fun, I know that's strange, so I admit that to you, please do with it what you will. But, green flashing, okay, there we go. Fiqh is how one is supposed to understand law, and it's inherently human-derived understanding, and therefore fallible. Sharia is certain, true, it is the law as God knows it. Fiqh is humanly interpreted and subject to being wrong. You can be wrong. Because we're humans. Nobody is perfect. Nobody doesn't make mistakes. Yeah, that's right. I'm going to read a verse from a translation of the Quran. By the way, this is not actually a Quran. I feel like a surrealist painting here. This is the Quran. This is a translation. The Quran is only the Quran if it's in Arabic. This is a translation interpretation. All translation involves interpretation. To take something from one language into another involves transmutation of meaning to make it comprehensible in another language. So this is an interpretation by a Pakistani scholar named Abdullah Yusuf Ali. It's a scholarly, slightly wonky translation, but it's good enough. And I'm going to read a verse from Surah 4, verse 43. So that's Surah 4, verse 43. It's a really good teaching example for how Islamic law works because, well, I actually didn't invent it. This was a teaching example. This is one that you'll find in the legal manuals where they're teaching Islamic legal scholars how to do Islamic law. This will be a prime example, and you'll see why in a second. O you who believe, do not approach prayers with a mind befogged until you can understand all that you say, nor in a state of ceremonial impurity, except when traveling on the road, until after washing your whole body. If you are ill, or on a journey, or one of you comes from offices of nature, or you have been in contact with women, and you find no water, then take for yourselves clean sand or earth, and rub therewith your faces and hands, for God blots out sins and forgives again and again. A couple things first. One, the word Allah. The word Allah has two components. Ilah is the word for God, and al is the definite article, the. So Allah is just the God. And I say that to clarify because sometimes people don't translate it, they just say Allah. I always translate it because to do so introduces a layer of complexity that doesn't really exist. Arabic speakers who are Christian use the same word for God. It just means the God, the monotheist, that God. That's one thing. The second thing, and this is where we get into this is teaching law as a book. When it says, when you come from offices of nature, or one of you comes from offices of nature, okay, Abdullah Yusuf Ali is being a bit squeamish when he's translating that. That in the Arabic is absolutely explicitly clear. Offices of nature does not capture it. It is the word al-khalit in Arabic. It means the place where you poop. That's what it means. The place where you do that thing. And there's no ambiguity whatsoever. The Quran tells you, wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. That is Sharia. Because there's no ambiguity. God has told you explicitly in the Quran, those are God's words, and there's no way around what God is saying there. It's absolutely clear. Unambiguous. That's in the category of Sharia. We know what God wants because God has told us explicitly. And when I say explicitly, I mean that literally is what the word means. The place where you defecate. One can make an argument about peeing, but so you two usually go together. Better to be safe, wash your hands after the bathroom. Okay, that's a general good rule. The next bit that gets us into the realm of fiqh is that contact with women. Or you have been in contact with women. What's the issue here is, before you pray, you have to wash ritually. You have to ritually cleanse yourself as a way of shifting from this state of being into a spiritual state of being where you're conscious and cognizant of your space before God and praying. That's what the ritual ablution is supposed to do, and it is to remove impurities. So, contact with women is actually important to know what that means, but it's ambiguous in Arabic. What is contact? And by the way, when the Quran mentions gender, it flips back and forth throughout the text so that it's clear that it applies to men and women, and it goes back and forth. Even in the middle of a verse, it'll switch gender pronouns so that you're clearly operating in a space that applies to both. What is contact? What is contact? I sent you an email. Is that contact? Maybe a text? No, that doesn't mean it. We shook hands? That counts as contact? Or does it mean something more intimate? The Arabic word can have a range of meanings, all the way from the lulu to the hi, how you doing? Like, that whole range, and it's not entirely clear what that means. And I said, who? Nobody said, not even her, like, I don't even know. So in that space, we don't know what it means. Now we're in the realm of fiqh, of trying to understand what it is that God is telling us. And since the Quran doesn't tell us exactly, we now have to turn to the second source. There are 4 sources for Islamic law. And these are the usul al-fiqh, the roots of understanding. Usul being roots, understanding, roots of understanding. And there are 4 sources for it. One, the first one, of course, is the Quran. The second is the Sunnah. And the Sunnah is the correct precedented behavior as established by Muhammad. That sounds awfully technical. Let me break it down a little bit. Because Muhammad is the conduit for the Quran, he understands it more clearly than anybody else. And if he does or says something, then that clearly means this is a correct interpretation of the Quran, and therefore that is a good model to follow for behavior of how to be a good person, live the right life, and get to heaven. So the Sunnah is things that Muhammad said or did that are a guide, that can help you to see what Sharia might be. Now I use that word might intentionally because how do we know what the surah is? Well, we know what the surah is by sifting through hadith. Hadith are small snippets, accounts of things that Muhammad said or did that provide guidance. And there are hundreds of thousands of them that are collected in the 9th century into books that you can then look in and find hadith that will guide you to Sunnah. You have to sift through a whole bunch of them, and what you do is you gather as many as you can, and you see what the prevailing direction is that they guide you towards. If they tell you all in one direction, well, that's very clear that we're pretty sure that we've identified the Sunnah correctly. But somebody else might come back and say, yes, but this other group of hadith point in this other direction, and Sunnah can actually be an argument. And just to sort of clarify what a hadith sounds like, I'm going to recite one for you that helps us understand about our ambiguity in the Quran verse. Muhammad ibn Bashir heard from Yahya, who was told by Sufyan, who was told by Ibrahim Taymi, who was told by Aisha that Muhammad kissed her and did not perform ablution. We now have a hadith, and if we sift through, we can find a bunch of hadith that maybe guide us to tell us that contact, the word in Arabic that's used, is actually intending something more intimate than casual. It is not the hi, how you doing? It's not shaking hands. A husband and wife kissing just sort of casually as one does not render one ritually impure, and therefore you have to then do the ritual ablutions again and again after having done it, getting ready for prayer. That gives guidance as to what the Sunnah might be. And there it goes. There. Yeah. The channel will be back in a second. It's like static, green screen, back and forth. So the Sunnah is an argument over what the hadith can tell you. It is an argument over what should be the right thing to do, but you're not sure. So Quran yields certainty. If it's in the Quran, then you know that is Sharia. but less than the Quran, and you're in the realm of human fallibility and probability, and you want to make the most probable case that you've got the right answer. So you have to know and understand that Islamic law is inherently imbued with uncertainty, the uncertainty principle. People do the best that they can, but there can be legitimate disagreement over what actually is supposed to be done. That's where the space for diversity that I mentioned at the very beginning really comes into play, is that there is space for interpretation of what the Quran means and disagreement. Now, the other two sources, the next one, is called ijma'. Now, ijma' is the most powerful, other than the Quran, in terms of legal force, but it's also the least useful. If you're a legal scholar trying to parse an answer to a legal problem, ijma' is great, but almost never happens. It is consensus. Everybody in this room agrees. There's not enough parking immediately outside the building. We need to build a parking garage. Actually, we're going to tear down one of the buildings here, the College Center. Let's do that. Tear that building down. We're going to put a gigantic parking garage right there. Everybody agree that's a great idea? Well, see, yeah, okay. I heard lots of yeses, and I want to go with yeses, so we're going to do that. Actually, it doesn't work that way. The thing about consensus is, one, you have to ascertain who counts, whose voice is, okay, anyone who said no has to leave, and we're not going to count your voice because, well, or anybody who said yes has to leave because you have to determine whose voice counts, why they count, and you have to, what constitutes agreement. We all agree that parking is an issue, but we don't all agree, well, actually, some of us may not agree that that's an issue. The solution is to build another parking garage. Maybe there's not agreement on that either. The trick with ijma' is that if the entire community agrees on something, then that is certainty, because God is not going to let everybody agree on something that's wrong. But good luck getting agreement on that. On just about anything. This is true of all religious traditions. They all have this issue where you take a group of believers in the room and they'll say, oh yeah, we believe it. And then you start to ask them nitpicky questions and I don't agree with that. Islam functions in the exact same way as all other religions. The actual most useful of the usul of fiqh is something called qiyas. And that's an analogy. I'm going to draw an analogy from one case to another case. I have a case that I know the answer to. I know that this is resolved, this legal question is resolved in this way, and in this case over here, it's different, but it shares something in common with this other one, so I can take this decision and bring it over here. The classic example for understanding this is, you heard that Muslims don't drink alcohol, right? That alcohol is haram, it's forbidden. Well, that actually could be debated, but the way that is derived is the Quran actually says red wine. It says khamr. It actually is very clear. And this is in the case of Sharia, that red wine is forbidden for a variety of reasons. It causes dissension, it's a tool of Satan, bad stuff. It does not say alcohol is forbidden. The legal scholars said, okay, what is it about red wine that makes it forbidden? What does it do? Why would it be forbidden? Well, wait, these people are drinking beer, or these people who are drinking moonshine, just try it. And they end up doing the same thing. This person who's drinking lots of red wine, this person who drinks a lot of beer, and this person who's drinking whatever alcohol, hard alcohol, they all end up behaving in very similar ways, and it does this, and it's destructive, and So, red wine is forbidden because it causes dissension, it's a tool of Satan, it does all these things, it causes you to lie, it makes you legally incompetent, you can't do contracts or anything like that when you consume alcohol, you consume red wine. So therefore these other things are forbidden as well. And what is it in, say, the wine that is similar to the beer, that's similar to the hard alcohol, the hard liquor, is the alcohol molecule. So therefore, these are all forbidden because they do the same thing as red wine. That's how the analogy works. But that, of course, means the pot's okay. Well, maybe not. Because if one looks at that verse that approach not prayers that the mind be followed, that's one of the reasons why alcohol is forbidden, is that it clouds your mind. Your body cannot metabolize the alcohol fast enough that you would be able to get to prayers. There's pray enough time in a day. You couldn't If you got drunk, be sober enough to pray the next prayer. Well, substances that do that to you are therefore out of bounds. The reason I highlight this is that Islamic law is actually really flexible for how it deals with new cases, new problems that humans are always, we are a kaleidoscope of opportunities for misbehavior. That human beings invent, we're very creative, we invent all kinds of new things. And Islamic law is flexible enough to account for that. Now, if you are interpreting Islamic law, if you are going through the sources and you're looking at a problem and you're going to answer, well, okay, what's the answer to this question? What's the answer to the problem? You are going to find an answer based on who you are, when you are, and where you are. That if you're a scholar in Detroit and you're reading the Quran in the context of 1980s Detroit, just picking a time, a particularly bad time for Detroit. If you're reading the text in that context, you're going to see different things than somebody who's reading in, say, Jakarta in 2020, or in Tehran, or in Baghdad, or in London, or wherever you happen to be. Who you are surrounded by will inform your reading of the text, your Quran, what you see in the text, what you see in the Sunnah, and how you draw the legal analogies. That human beings adapt. And we adapt our readings and understandings to make sense of our world and to guide people, to guide ourselves or whoever, that the meaning is flexible. So when somebody says the Quran says, well, the Quran says, but what does the Quran mean? And when you're reading and trying to develop an understanding, you have to account for the diversity. And that's one of the main points I wanted to make tonight, was that people talk about Islam as this monolith. And the reality is that there are 1.6 billion Muslims in this world. You cannot talk about them as one thing, any more than you would talk about any other religious tradition. So you have to read the Quran, you have to listen to the Quran with an understanding of the impact that it has on the listener, the believer, the meaning of it, the context of it, and the ability to see things differently in it. And that's where I want to end, because I want to open up a little bit of space for questions, because usually something has triggered somebody who wants to know about jihad or uses of the Quran for fighting purposes.
I would like to ask for your personal opinion. So would you prefer a religion with various interpretations and have room for disagreements, or a religion with a unified interpretation with rebels?
That's a difficult question, because one of the inherent assumptions that one would have to make, if we're going to assume that there's agreement and that everybody has a similar understanding, then that involves a certain level of coercion. The truth is that you take any group of human beings and you put them in one room and you ask them a question about faith practice, and you will find that even people who have similar backgrounds and similar sort of the things that they bring into the room that are very similar, they will end up disagreeing on interpretation. If you took 100 Christians and you put them in a room, 100 Christians from around the world, and you said, okay, what's Christianity? You would find essentially one point of agreement. But they would all agree that there was a guy named Jesus. So all religious traditions, all of them, function with that inherent level of diversity, and there is no way of shaping it so that there isn't that disagreement. So acknowledging disagreement, acknowledging diversity of opinion is actually fairly healthy. And most religious traditions do that, even if at the surface level they sort of say, hey, we all agree on. But once you start to probe, people go, oh, well, yeah, we kind of differ on that, we kind of don't agree on that. So faith practice is inherently variable, and really, you're never going to get any sort of full agreement on anything, really, like parking.
This might sound like a bit of a silly question, but I was just wondering, if there was a solar eclipse during Ramadan, would the Muslims be allowed to eat?
Well, if there's an eclipse, yeah. Because if the sun's gone, then sure. But actually, practical realities, they say, during normal daylight hours, if an eclipse occurs, that doesn't actually change the length of the day. It might be an interruption, but that would be, like, it's better to be safe than sorry. Another example that often comes up is like, what do people do? Chewing gum. Can you chew gum during Ramadan? The answer is no. Well, okay, maybe. You find disagreement based on who you ask. But a solar eclipse would probably be deemed as just an aberration during the day, and you would observe the fast during those minutes. Like, that's a really quick drink of water. My favorite legal ruling, by the way, that I never encountered, but from the scholar is, if you're on the International Space Station, which direction do you pray? And the answer is down. You pray because every 90 minutes you're circling the Earth. So at some point, it can be virtually impossible to get the right direction. So you aim in the right direction, and you'll hit it eventually.
You mentioned earlier that 40 was the ideal age for a prophet, and I know theoretically Jesus lived to be 33.
Yes.
Very important prophet in Islam. So I was wondering, what's the rationalization of?
It's not a hard and fast rule. It's just sort of the norm. Jesus, of course, is an exception, and is mentioned in the Quran. Actually, just as a side note, his mother Mary gets an entire surah to herself about her the birth and Jesus and all the attendant things with it. He's an exception, but the Quran is very clear and regular in rules to make sure that people know that Jesus is a prophet, but not the son of God. But the Quran is very clear on that. It actually, when you read the Quranic descriptions of Jesus, it very much resembles one strand of early Christological theory, that a particular argument called Arianism, A-R-I, not Arian as in the white people thing, but as in a early monk, Christian monk, who talked about what was the nature of Christ. And the Quran actually seems to be, the vision in the Quran seems to be actually pretty close to that. So again, historical context it matters.
So some sects of Christianity don't allow women to use epidurals or anesthesia during childbirth. Is that deep for Muslims as well because of the whole drugs sloppiness idea, or is that kind of covered by, like, if you're sick, then you don't have to pray?
Yeah, it's covered by the if you're sick. The health of the person, if the health of the person is involved, then you can do what is necessary. So the Quran actually, it says in a couple of places, it gives rules on what you can and cannot eat. So you can't eat pork, and you shouldn't eat carrion, which is roadkill. But if you're starving and you're going to die, you can eat that. And there are explicit exceptions in the Quran for that. Same with the Hajj. The Hajj is clearly, you have to do it, but if you can't, there are these things, there are exceptions. And in Ramadan, if you're traveling, you don't have to do the fast. And for prayer, if you're traveling and you can't stop and pray, that's actually, so there are all kinds of caveats throughout the Quran that indicate that if it is going to harm you in any way to do something, then you shouldn't do that thing that's going to cause harm. So for epidurals and things like that, perfectly okay. Even though it has that effect. Although it's not, the epidural doesn't make you oozy. Having been in them for 2 childbirths, you get yelled at the same. The notion though that, that's okay. Remind me later. Adobe wants me to install software, and I'm going to tell them, haram. Haram is the Arabic word for forbidden. You shouldn't do that. Just like halal is the word for it. It's okay, it's permitted. Other questions? Yes, please. Maybe we. Okay, if I can hear you. So abortion. In the Quran, there's lots of debate about whether abortion is acceptable or not. And under the rules of the Quran, there are those who will argue that the sanctity of the life of the existing person, the mother, takes precedence over that of the potential. There will be others who will read the Quran as saying something to the effect that all life is sacred, no matter what. And so there's a range for interpretation. So it's in the realm of khayr. Not sure. So there's space for dispute about that, on how one reads the text. But there'll be people who, as with other religious traditions, who feel very strongly one way or the other about it, and interpret the text as giving clear guidance, and the others saying that their position has clear guidance. And so there's space for dispute. It depends on how one reads the provisions for not engaging the health of a person that I mentioned just a second ago, that if one reads that as superseding that of the potential life, then abortion will be accepted. But that's subject to interpretation and lots of disagreement. Another question? Nobody's asked about jihad. That's interesting.
In reading the Quran this time, I was struck by the focus on what I would call sort of ritualized sacrifice as part of the Muslim experience. And I think of regular prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, and so I'm asking you your subjective experience. I assume you've lived in Muslim majority places of the general cultural impact of this aspect. I can imagine there would be many benefits of these pillars in a religious experience.
Well, in terms of animal sacrifice, one of the things about the halal rules, it's kind of similar to kosher, the kashrut in Judaism, that although it's a general rule that if it's kosher, it's halal except for wine, but the vice versa, there are things that are halal that are not kosher, like you can eat shellfish and lobster is perfectly okay under Islam, and if you're really strictly kosher, it's not. But one of the rules for halal is how you slaughter an animal, how you kill an animal. So it's not necessarily about ritual slaughter, it's about the rules are to kill the animal in the most humane way possible.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean animal sacrifice. I mean personal sacrifice.
Oh, okay.
Individual
I thought you were talking about meat.
of the believer in terms of there are many ritualized aspects
Yes.
of Islamic living, prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, and I can imagine that has a huge impact on collective culture and just what your subjective experience of that is.
I misunderstood your question.
Right.
I thought we were talking about hamburgers. Cheeseburgers are halal, by the way. They're not kosher. But sacrifice in ways that focus the mind. So it's not sacrifice like an aesthetic, just as self-deprivation to sort of cleanse myself of the worldly. It is a way of switching yourself from this worldly reality where I'm consumed by my daily life. So the ritual of washing up before prayer is a good analogy because it's a way of separating what I'm doing here from what I'm doing there. And so if you don't have water, you can actually use sand. Surah 4, verse 43 explicitly says that you can use sand instead of water. So it's not really about the cleaning, although sand can clean if you really work on it. But then that's what Ramadan is too. That it is separating yourself from what it is, your normal daily existence, so that you can focus on God and the importance of life. And in the evening, as part of the breaking the fast, it's a lot of fun actually. Ramadan during the day is not a fun place if you're like in Tunisia in August, or Cairo. Cairo in August is grumpy anyway. It's the loudest city on the planet, just bar none. But during Ramadan, it's really loud and angry, just because it's a major city. But in the evening, when everybody sort of is done with the fast, you have a community meal, a family gathering, and everybody eats together and they share in the meal in which you appreciate the food more. And so that kind of a communal experience, it reinforces the sense of we're all in this together. There's the sense of shared presence. That the sacrifice, it magnifies those moments in ways that is different than sort of normal, what you would consider asceticism or world renunciation. So I think that's what you were doing. Yeah, and Cairo is the loudest place in the world. New York is the city that never sleeps. Cairo is the city that never shuts off.
Can I ask about music?
Music?
Yes, music in Islamic rituals.
Music is a fundamental part. When you listen to the Quran, it's not music, but it is musical in the sense that the melodic sounds and the rhythm of the Quran people will listen to it in their cars when they're driving. You'll be in a bus, and the driver will put a Quran CD in, and you're listening to it, and everybody's kind of bopping along to it, which seems really weird because you never have somebody reading the Bible, and you're like, I mean, they might, but it wouldn't be sort of this meditative, sort of listening to music in the background. The Quran is used in that way, in many ways, as sort of meditative ambiance setting in the back of your head, sinking in. But you also have other kinds of musical forms. My favorite are the oud, which is kind of like a lute. It's an early form of guitar with drums and a zither, and you also see it as part of ritual practice. Have you ever seen the whirling dervishes? These are guys that are wearing long skirts, and they'll spin, they'll do a dance, and they're spinning, and they're listening typically very mellow flute music, and somebody reciting poetry. They're reciting the poetry of Rumi, who is a Persian language poet in the 14th century. And if you go to the bookstore, you see Rumi, he's usually in the love poetry section. Love is towards to God in poetry. And just a pro tip for you, Persian doesn't have gender and language at all. It just has one pronoun. And so there's no he, there's no she, there just is that pronoun. So when you're reading Rumi's poetry, you can change the pronouns however you want. To whoever you're reading the poetry to, you can change the pronouns. But typically music can be religious, it can be meditative, it can also be dancing, it can be fun. Weddings are really a lot of fun. So there will always be music at weddings. So it doesn't have to be sort of religious. Music has a space in all human existence. I have yet to see a culture that doesn't have some form of musicality. And the Middle East is lots of music and dancing.
I had a question on coercion and punishment. So how do you enforce laws relating to religion without intentionally coercing people by their punishments?
You actually can't. And this is something about the Middle East that in particular people talk about the Middle East as Muslim governments, Islamic states, that there actually isn't any government in the Middle East that uses Islamic law. They don't use the Sharia system, they'll use Sharia inspired. That the legal systems in the Middle East of all of the countries are essentially secular nationalists that make a claim to some sort of moral basis. Much like people will say the death penalty in the American legal code is really about thou shalt not kill. And it's similar in Egypt or Syria or Lebanon or any of the Middle Eastern countries, that the religious law is essentially, it's between you and God. None of those things are actually really punishable. One of the things that's for Sharia law, the rules of evidence are so strict that you can't get a conviction, realistically. So when the Quran forbids theft, and it actually specifies that if you get caught stealing, you can lose your right hand. And so you hear about the Saudi government cutting off hands on a routine basis. Under the rules of evidence, though, under the Sharia system, the person has to refuse to repent, refuse to offer restitution 3 times. They have to be asked 3 times, did you do it? Okay, you didn't do it, but are you willing to pay restitution? And they have to say no 3 times, and okay, we'll cut your hand off. For unlawful intercourse, adultery, zina, in the Quran it says this is forbidden, you're supposed to get 80 lashes for it, or in the Quran. The rules of evidence are you have to have 4 adult male eyewitnesses to say that it is not simulated act. Think about that for a second. Are you ever going to get anyone convicted on that? No. So when you hear of somebody being convicted for adultery, it's not in a Sharia legal system. It's in a Sharia-inspired system in which they say, you don't actually need 4 adult male eyewitnesses in the room saying, actually, yeah. So this system is always paired with another administrative legal system that uses it for inspiration but can't possibly function or govern a society. The mic.
So as I was reading Surah 4, I came across verses 15 and 16, which talk about the lewdness of women versus the lewdness of 2 men specifically.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could clarify that or interpret that a little bit better.
This one usually elicits some questions. This is that space for interpretation. This is an allusion to, or generally taken to be an allusion to Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's how it's usually interpreted. And lewdness is a translation that isn't exactly, well, it's one way of reading the Arabic. Another way of reading the story and understanding the Arabic when you read it in its full context is to say that the crime for which the men are being punished isn't necessarily sex between two men. It is that they have offered up people for rape, that they're being condemned and convicted for facilitating rape, and that that's the crime for which they're being punished, not the men having sex with men, or the possibility of women having sex with women. Some will interpret this as being, that verse and those series of verses being an absolute prohibition of homosexuality, but that's not typically how verses were interpreted until you get into the 19th century with British Victorian, the Brits export Victorian ideas to the rest of the world. And before that point, homosexuality was viewed as sort of a phase of humanity, that humans exist on a continuum, and there are some people who are attracted to their same sex, and there are some people who aren't, who are attracted to the opposite sex, and that was normal, and you could float between those in the course of your life. And the gender boundaries of the definitions of masculinity go through a profound shift after contact with the British and Victorian ideas. And that verse begins to be read as an absolute prohibition of homosexuality, whereas before that encounter, it's not. So it makes for a very interesting moment of interpretation in the text. Yes, the Brits export lots of things to the world. And they bring lots of things home to the British Museum. But eventually, maybe they have to give them back to the Greeks. One more question, maybe?
Hi.
Hi.
You seem really intent on what I was talking about jihad. So I decided to think of a question you invited me. So, you talked earlier about the Crusades and the violence can kind of be justified within a religious text if you decide to take it that way. But, sorry. In modern culture, we kind of have the whole jihad and Muslims being that stereotypical violent religion that you were talking about. And I was wondering how you felt about whether or not that the Quran has more of a blatant support for violent acts as opposed to the Bible, or if the Bible has an equal amount of support for those acts, and if so, why is it that we see it more so with the stereotypical Muslim religion and or jihad as opposed to Christianity?
That's a gigantic question. I'll get at it the most succinctly I can. One, the Bible actually has lots of violence in it. The Hebrew Bible has actually admonitions to encourage genocide. That it actually has that. But we choose to say that's not the part that we're paying attention to. That's the part that we're not. And so those verses don't get brought up because, well, people generally agree that those things don't really apply. And the Quran is similar, except that in the context of empire and the imposition of, say, the British or the French or the Russians or the Austro-Hungarians or whoever it happens to be in the 19th century, particularly against the Ottoman Empire or against the Iranians or in South Asia and what's India, Pakistan, you find a space where people decide, how do we resist? How do we fight back against the imperial domination? And then they start to use the language of religion as a way of finding unity. And that, yes, the vocabulary has a root in religion, but it is distinctly about how do we fight against this power that is stronger than us? How do we find a way, a justification for that violence against? Now, reality is that the overwhelming majority of instances of terrorism in the world are committed by white guys. The last 10 years, 80% of the terrorist acts in Europe were committed by people who are either racist nationalists or somehow targeting minority communities. But yet we only ever talk about the 20% that somehow involve Muslims. That it is more likely, far more likely, that you're going to find somebody like Anders Breivik, who in Norway a number of years ago went to a camp for kids and killed a bunch of them because he was a crusader. He actually talks about himself as a crusader. He's in prison in Norway now. That because of the way we talk about it, it appears that there's more violence amongst Muslims than in Islam, when the reality is it actually is not. It's overrepresented in the stories, but not in actual statistical reality. So a lot of that is how we talk about it. It's a lot about how we perceive violence around us. And so it is not that Islam somehow encourages violence more, or that the Quran is read as more violent. It is that we end up talking about the violence, that specific mode of violence, more than other modes of violence. That's the most succinct way to answer your question. But it is a gigantic one. And I don't want to downplay the fact that it does, that there is this violence out there. But we need to nuance our understanding of it and have a greater sense of the context of it and how it fits in the bigger picture. Islam and Muslims are no more violent than any other group of human beings. And that the diversity included in those terms is so big that it's really hard to actually use them as generic labels for anything. Muslims in Iraq, Muslims in Indonesia, Muslims in France, Christians in France, Christians in Iraq, Christians in Indonesia. They give us the same levels of descriptive power, but we also have to acknowledge that they are regional and geographic specificities that make those people different. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. I think we're at time. Thank you so much for your time.